many times now in the narrative in media, or when people are talking about India, because of course there's a re-emergent power which is coming from India, right? Because after the British rule, there was this kind of colonial hangover where Indians felt that, to be accepted in the world, they have to kind of follow the British protocol, which is speak the language well, study in a university abroad, and do the things that were prescribed by that particular quote-unquote culture or that way of life. But now there's this sort of the Indians are embracing their own language. There's a resurgence of a lot of Indian-based belief systems and Indian-based practices. But a lot of times what happens, which is a positive thing, of course, I want to say initially, but a lot of times what happens is if someone does something against the grain or the fabric of what is perceived as Indian culture, people are like, that's not Indian culture. And that's such a broad term, because India is a country of so many languages, and each geography varies from another just by virtue of what people eat, what people believe in, the practices. And yes, we can say Hinduism and Islam and Christianity, the bigger religions, but there are a lot of these sub-contexts that are so unique to a country like ours. And of course, that every country has its own signature for that particular group and that particular cultural identity. But when the negative side is when you sort of put everyone into such broad brushstrokes as Indian culture, I feel it takes away from a lot of the nuances and things that make these groups and make these these subgroups, if you want to call them, so interesting and so culturally rich for a country, right?
Absolutely. And I think it's fascinating that people talk about an Indian culture because I know what they mean. I know a lot of Indians. I've had several Indians as graduate students that I've mentored. I have many Indian colleagues now. I've been invited to India and spent time there and talked to many, many Indians. So I
Mm-hmm.
know what they mean. And when I meet an Indian person, I have certain expectations based on what I know of Indian culture. But
Yeah.
at the same time, one of the things that makes Indian fascinating is that it's a place of hundreds of cultures. I mean, it's an amazing place. It's incredibly culturally diverse.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only that you have, yes, you have the Hindu culture that's dominant, you also have the second largest Muslim population in the world, over
Yeah.
200 million Muslims. That's a culture of itself, too. I mean, they're Indian, too, but they're
Mm-hmm.
obviously not the same in many ways as the Hindus. That's a running tension
Mm-hmm.
that's part of Indian society. I think it's part of its vitality and part of its potential. But you also have hundreds of these local cultures where they have a specific language and they have their way of dress. They have distinctive foods and they have distinctive beliefs. They have their own sort of tribal local beliefs. So it's an amazing place. I can tell
Yeah.
you, anthropologists have found it fascinating for over a century because everywhere you go in India, there are these distinctive cultures all over the place. And yes, there's a common Indian culture, but there's also incredible diversity within that broad umbrella.
And I think that is something that goes unacknowledged, because many times, and that's a really, I think, important point in today's context, is when, yes, the cultural values or the cultural bond is something which is so inherent and it's important for human beings. And over years, we've developed these cultural things, as you said, familial relationships. It could be the parent-child relationship. It could be the language. It could be the food. It could be rituals which are passed on because of whatever thing they served, right? Whether it's religious rituals, whether it's waking up early, having a bath on a festival day, keeping clean. These could be for hygiene. It could be for preserving this sense of a civilized way of living. And what happens as a result is you have these things, and if I might call them so, many of these things could be even like guiding principles that are wise in their ways. That's why they've stood the test of time. But the exclusive nature of this is that my practice is better than yours. My practices are better than yours. And that creates this thing where you forget the human being, or you forget about the nuance, or you forget about the importance of these little things that make us different or make our groups different. But then you look at the larger things, which is, oh, they eat pork, I'm a vegetarian, or you know what I mean? These small things
Yeah.
can become very sort of it can be create a lot of animosity, and you forget to see the things that make us similar and appreciate the differences, as opposed to that you see the differences as a point of hate-based way of viewing that group. And that is, I feel a lot of that is starting to happen, or maybe it's the undercurrents have been there, but it's coming to the forefront more and more. And I wanted to say one more thing before I hand it over to you, is that with all the tension and with all the disparity in India for years, there's still been some sense of coherence despite the various languages, the subcultures or the cultures. But we've always seemed to find some sense of unity when it comes to kind of getting by every day. Of course, I'm not talking about in the face of being invaded by the Mughals or the British. Of course, there was a lot of division then. But I'm saying there's something that's kept the fabric together. And not every day do you see violence or like these mass shootings or whatever it may be, right? But I feel the undercurrent of that tension is coming, and more people are looking at these one or two points to look at another group saying they are not us, they are not similar, they go against a certain sense of what it's meant to be Indian. And why does that happen?
Yeah, I think it is contested what is Indian. And it always, maybe always has been, certainly since the British have been there and enforced a lot of British things on Indian society. And as you said, there's a hangover from the British occupation. It's still there. And it might have certain benefits. I've heard that the judicial system that the British established is a very valued part of Indian society. It's still there. It still functions reasonably well. The train system was built by the British, and that the crucial part of Indian society. There may be certain advantages to it, but that hangover is still there. So what it is Indian today, I think, is contested and maybe inevitably in a place that's so diverse. But you know India obviously better than I do. I only know it as an outsider and somebody who knows some Indians and has been there briefly. I guess I hope good things for India. I hope you keep it together without splintering more. And I think that's difficult to do with all the tensions between Muslims and Hindus and now Christians. I know there's a lot of Christian proselytizing in India that is resented by Hindus. And then you have, again, all the tribal groups, the smaller groups that they have their own ways of life. How are those going to be maintained and remain distinct in modern society, I think is a good question. But I think there are always challenges for India. There are challenges in my country, in the US too. I mean, we feel like we're splintering right now, honestly. Maybe worse than India is.
Yeah.
At least that's what it seems to me as somebody who lives there. I think it is always a challenge, this tension between unity and diversity in any society.
Right.
We benefit from a cultural way of life. It helps us structure life. It helps us know what to expect. It helps make human relations smoother when we have expectations for what father is going to do in relation to child and mother is going to do in relation to father. And head of the household is going to do in relation to head of other households. And the way marriage is structured is a crucial way that social life is structured, right? You have still a dominance of arranged marriage in India. And that, to an American, to many people in the West, seems bizarre. How could you allow somebody else, your parents, to make such a crucial decision for you? But there are a lot of benefits to it. It really, I've talked to a lot of Indians about it, and even highly educated Indians will often say, well, they know more than I do. They're more mature, they're more experienced. They love me and are devoted to me, so I trust them to make that decision. But that's a good example of how culture both structures and restricts or inhibits. Culture does help structure something like an arranged marriage, but obviously it inhibits individual choice because now somebody else is making that choice, not you, and such a crucial choice for setting up the rest of your life. So I think that's a dynamic that's a constant tension in a culture. It helps
Mm.
structure life, and it also restricts individual choice. So, how much individual choice are we going to allow?
Right.
We've always allowed a lot in the U.S., partly because we've always been this kind of mixing and colliding of different cultures. From the
Hmm.
time the first Europeans got here and found all sorts of Native American groups who were already having their own collisions. I mean, there were dozens, maybe hundreds of Native American cultures. And now the Europeans come in and they bring the slaves, they bring thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of slaves. And now there's that tension as part of our heritage. And then we let in immigrants from all around the world. And we have this tremendous colliding of different cultures. And so we're trying to find an American way of life. We have been since our origins, trying to find American life that is a common thing that we can have as a basis of our national life and that allows
Mm.
us to speak to each other and live together, but at the same time allow for cultural diversity and individual diversity. That's a tension you find maybe more in the US than just about any other country, although I think it's abundant in India too.
Yeah, which is, I think, quite amazing, right? Because there's this um, group of, and I hate the fact that it comes down to color, because sometimes it's so many different cultures or different ethnic groups, and it's just broken down into, the African Americans, the white Americans, the Caucasian Americans, the Asians. And I feel that America is much more diverse and much more got a lot more depth when it comes to the number of kinds of people who come there, because of just the way the immigrants have been flocking to America for years. And what I would like to talk about is this sense. See, when it comes to a lot of the traits, when it came to in India and Indians, it was a sense of duty. And as you mentioned, for the arranged marriage, you are willing to forsake your individual choice and trust in your family choosing a partner for you. Or this sense of, I will do what my parents expect me to do because that's what society or our group will judge us by. And if I do something against their will, I've let them down. I'm a bad son, I'm a bad child, and now everyone's going to judge my family. And of course, if you look at in Afghanistan, they have this thing of honor, right? If your family name has been dishonored, then it's your entire life's mission to kind of, seek vengeance and regain that honor. So it's just one example in my limited knowledge. But what I want to understand is, say in America, a lot of people say it's the gun culture, or they say it's this culture. What when it's that narrative for a cultural group, right? Whether it's it's the South Indians who have a certain way of how the family and the male child should be, or the girl child should be, say, or if it's like in the African American culture, it's how there is certain cultural traits that are predominant. I know I'm being a little vague with the examples, but I want to understand, because from a psychological point of view, how important are these to shape a person's perspective and worldview?
Well, I think, again, there's this theme of unity and diversity. I think people who live here, who grow up here, and many of the immigrants as well, they feel American in the sense that they are inspired by the ideal of freedom and possibility.
Hmm.
That's one thing that has distinguished the US since the beginning. It's the ideal of freedom and wide open possibility.
Hmm.
Now, that's never been exactly the reality from the beginning. I mean, we had these authors of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution who wrote all these flowery words about freedom.
Hmm.
But at that time, it was freedom for a very limited portion of society. It was only white land owning men. Those were the only people could vote. Thomas Jefferson, who wrote those inspiring words of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Wow, what amazing words.
Yeah.
He owned slaves his entire adult life. Owned other men and women. He bought and sold them. He exploited their labor and paid them nothing. And yet he could write those words. And I believe he wrote them in all sincerity.
Yeah.
And we've kind of been living with that legacy ever since. It's an ideal of freedom and possibility, but it's a reality that's much more restricted and much less inspiring, honestly. It's much messier.
Yeah.
It's striving for that ideal of freedom and possibility while living with the messy reality that not everybody gets an equal share of that freedom. And some people in his time, including his own slaves, got no freedom at all. And so we have that tension still. It's an amazing place. We still let in millions of immigrants every year, including many from India. I mean, we've really had a huge surge of Indian immigration in the last 50 years. And I think it's a tremendous thing for our society. I mean, I think the Hispanic immigrants and the Asian immigrants and the Muslim immigrants, they all add tremendous vitality to American society. But it's not an easy unity that we have, because even though we have those ideals, the reality of it is that we're human too, and we have our prejudices.
Yeah.
And we have our in-group, out-group kind of thinking where we like our way and we're a bit suspicious of people who have other ways, as people inevitably do when they come here from other countries and cultures. And so we're constantly living with that tension between unity and diversity, just like you are in India, and maybe more so in some ways because we allow so many more immigrants.